Thursday, July 11th. Midge and I were right. We did strike oil. There wasn't quite as much there as we had expected, but we hit oil all right. Uncle Al was right too about saying it was not advisable to try and buy up all the land around here. It was 10 o'clock before we were set to try pumping our well. News certainly gets around in a tiny place like Grover's Corner. I don't know how everybody heard about our oil well, but a crowd of people appeared out of nowhere. I guess people weren't quite as doubting as they acted. Aunt Mabel came over, Midge's mother, almost every other housewife in Grover's Corner. The man who was driving the bulldozer where the new house is being built, the milkman, the man who picks up laundry, and even Mr. Marble shut down his drilling rig for a little while. I don't know whether someone called the newspaper or whether Mr. Sylvester just happened by. He is the man who took the pictures of the buggy in the bathtub. Anyhow, he was on hand when we connected up the pump. We put the hose down in the well and set the little hand pump on a box, and I began pumping. Midge held a big galvanized steel bucket. At first the connection wasn't tight, and the pump kept sucking air. Then Mr. Marble tightened it, and I tried pumping again. I had made about 10 or 12 strokes when oil spouted out and into the bucket. Instead of everybody cheering as I expected, they all looked sort of silly. Mr. Marble said, "Well, I'll be a horned toad." I pumped the bucket about half full and then stopped. Mr. Sylvester stepped forward, stuck his finger in the bucket, and held it up to his nose. Then he rubbed his fingers together as Uncle Al had done the night before. "It's oil," he said. "You kids really have discovered oil." Everybody began to get excited at this point. There was a lot of noise, and 2 or 3 of the women rushed back home to telephone their friends. I guess everybody in that area would have been drilling wells in their backyards inside of another 15 minutes if it hadn't been for Midge's father. Mr. Glass had worked until 2 o'clock at the laboratory, so he didn't go to work this morning but slept late. I guess he got up about 10 and found that he was alone in the house. He went downstairs and had some toast and coffee, and then, noticing the crowd across the street, came over to investigate. Instead of sticking his finger in the oil as everyone else had done, he picked up a stick and stirred it a little and let it drip back into the bucket. "Oil," Midge said, gloating. "I'll be known as the Oil Queen of New Jersey." "It's oil, all right," Mr. Glass admitted. "It's been 10 years since I had much to do with oil, and I never was an expert, but just offhand, I'd say this wasn't crude oil. It looks more like one of the lighter grades of bunker oil fuel." Mr. Ainsworth, who is an elderly, retired plumber who lives 2 doors from Midge, started laughing. "That's what it is," he said. "It's fuel oil. There's a fuel oil tank under here. I remember when I was put in. That was at least 25 years ago. I think Jake Harris had a first oil burner in the township. That's a 1,000-gallon tank down there. The house stood right over there, about where you're standing, Emma, would be the furnace room." "It must be buried awfully deep," objected the milkman, who watched me put the hose down in the hole we had drilled. "It wasn't this deep originally," Mr. Ainsworth explained. "This ground was fairly level then. This little hill that we're standing on wasn't here at all. The ground right here was no higher than over there by the barn. Then when the highway department made that cutoff by the corner, they wanted some place to dump their dirt, and Harris let them dump it here. They graded it off and put some topsoil over it. That's when the foundation of the house got buried." Everybody just melted away. A few of them said something about being sorry, but as soon as they discovered we hadn't really brought in an oil well, they weren't interested much anymore. Mr. Marble slapped me on the back and said, "Cheer up, son. You struck a lot more oil than most wildcatters do when they first start." After a minute, there was only Midge, myself, Mr. Glass, and Mr. Sylvester left. Mr. Sylvester had been taking pictures, and he took one more with nobody standing by the pump except Midge and me. "Well, whether it's bunker oil or crude oil, there is some oil down there," he said. "What are you going to do with it?" "Let's measure and see how much is in there," Mr. Glass suggested. We found a long stick and poked it down the hole. Mr. Glass looked at the mark on the stick and said, "If that's a 1,000-gallon tank down there, there should be at least 300 gallons in it. I don't know how many years it's been, but it looks perfectly okay. I'll take a chance on it. If you can get it out, I'll pay you the current price for fuel oil." Mr. Glass and Mr. Sylvester walked off together, leaving Midge and me alone with our oil well. Then Midge turned and started toward her house. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Over to call the oil company," she said. "I want to find out how much fuel oil is." She came back in a few minutes and told me that it was 15 cents a gallon. That means that if we had 300 gallons, We had $45 worth of oil. We weren't millionaires, but $45 is a lot more than nothing, and at 15 cents a gallon, I'll be willing to pump the oil out with a hand pump and carry it across the street in buckets if necessary.